Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, my good people. I'm not sure where you are in the world right now or what time it is, but I'm sure it's good, or hopefully it's good. I wanted to talk a little bit about race, particularly the terminology that we use in the United States to identify people of a certain racial background or ethnic background. The term black and African American. So this will be a little quick video that's possibly something that anyone who was raised outside of the United States, whether they're white or a person of color, doesn't necessarily need to hear, as you've most likely been spared the effect of, you know, American ethnocentrism and the United States' arguably one-dimensional public education system. But however, for any of my fellow Americans, whether white or people of color, I think this might be a helpful starting point for us to collectively begin to address some of the problems associated with concepts like racism, uh, modern racism, systemic racism, overt racism, subtle racism, implicit bias, uh, stereotyping, cultural appropriation, and various other forms of prejudice and discrimination. Before any of those things can really be discussed in any meaningful way, it's probably a good idea for us to agree on our terminology, or at least understand what other people are saying when they use terms that are commonly used but don't necessarily have a commonly understood meaning, right? You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. It's a popular line from The Princess Bride, but we run into this issue when we are talking about black and African American. I run into a lot of white people who are confused about what is the appropriate term to use, what they should call a black person, whether they should say black or African American. And I've recently had this conversation with someone again, and I thought, maybe I should make a video about this. Maybe I could help clear up some of the confusion. And it's not just white people who have that issue. I hear black people equally confused, and because the terms are often used interchangeably as though they're synonymous, and they're not. So let me just go through what I'm talking about here. In previous videos and discussions and notes and posts that I put on Facebook, I've talked about how the terms Hispanic and Latino were not synonymous, even though they're also used interchangeably by a lot of demographics in the United States. But Hispanic being from a Spanish-speaking culture is certainly not a race, at least not a race as typically understood in American culture. And Latino, meaning originating from Latin America, it's debatable as to whether or not that should be considered a race or not. But they're clearly two different definitions, right? Not every Hispanic person is Latino, not every Latino is Hispanic, although they are often used interchangeably. On some U.S. government statistics, they're both considered a race on some, and on others, neither one is. So how convenient, right? So, but we run into similar problems when we attempt to classify U.S. citizens who have a darker skin tone than most Hispanics and Latinos. I'm talking about black people or African Americans, right? What's going on right now? It is, what's today's date? It is June 12th, 2020, and we seem to have Black Lives Matter protests going on really in multiple cities all across the United States and indeed all across the world. I, for one, am glad that this message is finally resonating worldwide, though obviously under horrific, tragic circumstances. But this, for me, it raises the question, who is black, right? And what does black mean? again, I talked about, running into people who, in this country anyway, seem to get the two terms confused: black, African American. Which one should I use? Is there a difference? Yada yada yada. Right. So basically, as much as I would like to instinctively pin this failure of understanding on white people, and blame it on white privilege and assume that this type of ignorance is specific to white people, I really can't do that because, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, there's just as many folks in the African American community that seem to be confused by this. So, and notice I used African American that time and not black, and there's a reason for that. They actually mean two different things. So black is a racial categorization, right? The black race. This term has a common usage in most of Western civilization and beyond. And so let me see. According to Wikipedia, the term black is used to describe persons who are perceived as dark skinned compared to other populations. It is mostly used for people of sub Saharan African descent and indigenous peoples of Oceania, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Generally speaking, indigenous African societies do not use the term black as a racial identity outside of influences brought by Western cultures. So, in other words, black is an ethnocentric term that was created by non black people to refer to a type of people who were perceived as being sufficiently different based on their skin complexion to be classified as their own race. African American, on the other hand, is not a race. African American is an ethnicity. Some popular actors, Idris Elba, John Boyega, Keenan Lonsdale, Tandy Newton, Letitia Wright, Lupita Nyong'o, I think that's how you say her name. They're all black actors, but none of them are African American, right? They're not American at all, actually, but they are black. And because they exist as part of a race that's been marginalized and discriminated against by the white majorities outside of the United States, they can identify with the Black Lives Movement. So Black Lives Matter is not just about African Americans, it's about black people all over the place. Wikipedia defines African American as an ethnic group of Americans with total or partial ancestry from any of the black racial groups of Africa. The phrase generally refers to descendants of enslaved black people who are from the United States. So that's what African American is. I talked about ethnicity a little while ago. I've also talked in the past about how race is really nothing more than a social construct. Race is not really a thing. We made it up, and in, in the words of George Carlin, race is an idea. It's a cute idea, but that's all it is, cute and fictional, right? In the biological sense, there's really no such thing as race. No, race is no more useful as a biological classification for humans than it would be for dogs. You wouldn't say that a yellow Labrador Retriever is a different race from a black Labrador Retriever. That would be absurd. They're not different races of dogs. They're both one, still dogs, and they're both still labs. So, we don't classify races of any other species other than humans, So that's kind of a pretty big proof that it's kind of a sociological thing and not a biological concept. The other proof is, pick 10 random Americans and 10 random South Africans and just ask them what race I am. So, most likely the majority of Americans polled are going to give you a different answer than the majority of South Africans polled, right? Because in America, most people would look at me and identify me as black, but in South Africa, most people would probably identify me as colored. So black as a race is defined and viewed within the cultural perspective of that particular society. So that demonstrates again that race is a social construct. It means different things depending on where you are. So what does ethnicity mean, right? We know what race is. It's kind of a social construct to where people have determined that you fit in this category because of your skin color. Well, then what is ethnicity? Um, Wikipedia defines ethnicity as an ethnic group or ethnicity is a category of people who identify with each other, usually on the basis of presumed similarities such as common language, ancestry, history, society, culture, nation, or social treatment within their residing area, right? Ethnicity is somewhat broad, it's somewhat vague, and yet specific elements that make up particular ethnic groups are generally agreed upon by members who represent that ethnicity. In Northern Europe, for example, you have Scandinavians and you have Anglo Saxons, right? They're both white people, they're both from Europe, and yet they're different ethnicities based on language, common history, religion, food, music, etc. In India, you've got Punjabis and you have Bengalis. They're both Indians, but different ethnicities, right? In the Middle East, you have Arabs and you have Persians. And in the United States, we have Creoles and Cajuns, right? Again, both native to the southern Louisiana region of the United States, both potentially French speaking or with a French speaking background. They both may even share the same racial makeup, but they are classified as two different ethnicities. Don't call a Cajun person Creole and don't call a Creole person Cajun. Them's fighting words, right? That's what an ethnicity is. It's basically a common background based on language, sometimes based on religion and various other things. And that brings me back to African American, which, as I said, is an ethnicity, not a race. African American is the ethnicity associated with most black people in the United States, but not all of them. The common theme, really, with African American is being a descendant of American slaves. And so some of the elements associated with African American ethnicity would be hairstyles, right? Afros in the 70s, or jerry curls in the 80s, or high top fades for men and weaves for women in the 90s. So these, along with other traditionally black hairstyles that came from Africa, braids, twisted locks, dreadlocks, cornrows, these have all been adopted into African American culture for decades, really in an attempt to bring black people back to their roots. So consequently, a lot of these hairstyles are now uniquely symbolic of African American ethnicity in the United States. They're part of that culture. Music would be another thing, right? Music is an identifying aspect of African American ethnicity. You have certain genres of music. You've got blues, jazz, gospel, rhythm and blues or R&B, funk, hip hop music, right? Neo soul. These are all different musical genres that were invented by and popularized by African Americans, and thus identifiable as a common theme to African American ethnicity. Soul food, which most people, I hope, have already experienced or at least know about. That would be another example of something uniquely identifiable as being part of African American culture or associated with the ethnicity of African Americans. Clothing style is another one, right? Hat to the back and my pants keep sagging. That's that's a line from a Criss Cross song from like 1993. I think TLC also had a song called Hat to the Back, but and I'm not going to talk about sagging it off because I have my opinions about it and everyone's entitled to their opinion. But the clothing style is something that is unique to cultures, and African Americans have, popularized certain clothing styles. And also this one might be a bit controversial. Language. African Americans commonly, not always, but commonly speak, well, African Americans typically speak English as their first language, as do most other ethnic groups in the United States. But there is a dialect of American English that originated in the African American community, and it's called, are you ready? African American Vernacular English, or AAVE, which is colloquially referred to as Ebonics. And I say that this is controversial because it's a dialect of English that has typically been viewed in the United States as uneducated, unintelligent, or just improper English. So there is some judgment that comes along with it. Many people in the African American community have embraced the dialect as their own. Others are very dismissive of it and offended that it's associated with African American culture. But at the end of the day, it is what it is, right? It's here and possibly here to stay. But I will say that despite the judgment of it as being improper by a lot of people, many elements of African American vernacular English, or Ebonics, many elements of that have been adopted and incorporated into mainstream English, or I might say culturally appropriated into the mainstream. And by the way, usually when words are culturally appropriated into American English, mainstream American English, that also means that they diffuse into English globally, because a lot of English around the world is influenced by the United States. So, words like bad as a euphemism for good, fresh, dope, homie, the bomb, holla, YOLO, twerk, biatch. These are all words or variations of words or different usages of English words that were popularized in the African American community, and a lot of them have gone mainstream. I mean, pretty much everyone knows what twerking is now, but in 1990, I suspect that probably only people who were associated with or in close proximity to the African American community knew what twerking was. And how they knew that, I don't know. I don't know how the term came into existence, but I know I've heard it forever. And now I'm only recently, within the last maybe 5 years, started hearing it, among mainstream, like on TV. I think I've even heard news people talk about it. I remember about 10 years ago, maybe it was a little bit longer than that, I heard Ryan Reynolds use the word biatch in that way in a movie called Waiting, which is a really entertaining movie. But as soon as I heard him say it, it was like mind blown. That was when the light bulb went off that, okay, this language, this pronunciation, this word usage is now mainstream. Like, it is not just black people using it. White people are saying biatch. They know what it means. And so, we're either going to keep it or we're going to give it up in the black community. But yeah, so there's a lot of words that come from African American vernacular that end up being appropriated into the mainstream. So as far as what African Americans should be called, this is variable and largely dependent on the individual. So as of 2020, based on my personal experience, most African Americans are fine being referred to as black. There's nothing wrong with black. Black is beautiful. It's a perfectly usable, some would say reclaimed term to be used as a racial categorization, right? So if you must categorize me by race, and we're in the United States at the time, then I'm fine being called black. And if we're in South Africa at the time, I'm fine being called colored. Just don't call me colored anywhere inside the United States, whether we're in New York, California, Texas, or Georgia. Colored means something different in the United States. It's archaic. It's often perceived as offensive, and basically we don't use that word anymore. And if you want to know why the term colored is considered archaic in the United States and why most people are offended by it, go to Wikipedia. When you get to Wikipedia in the search field, I want you to type Jim Crow laws and then read that article, and you will understand why that's no longer an appropriate term to use according to most African Americans. Some black people in America like to be called African American. I suspect it's because they choose to specifically want to identify themselves with that ethnicity, and that's fine too. I don't. For me, it doesn't matter. But again, at the end of the day, call people what they want to be called, right? So if you're not sure, ask, and the person will self-identify as what they identify as. Race is a social construct anyway, so it really doesn't matter. The only reason to call someone other than what they identify as is because you want to be a dick. So, yep, that's my spiel. That's the difference between black and African American. They're not always synonymous. Black is a race, African American is an ethnicity. I happen to be both. I'm not offended by either. And if you're not sure, just ask. This is Bryce.